In this video, I am going to analyze the meaning of Orot's poems. Let's begin. The first poem is introduced in the third episode of Book 2, read aloud by Bram from one of Orot's libraries.
O'er frozen wastes eternal gazing, ancient agonies survive. Thunder lost, lone voices praising, one from many thus derived.
I believe that this one is the easiest to understand among all the poems that she has written. This may also be the least ambiguous poem among them. To summarize, this brief poem explains the origins of the one we know as Oroth. The first stanza describes a frozen waste and its so-called eternal gazing. It shouldn't take much thinking to know that this frozen waste is actually Icewrack. How do I know this? It's because the writer mentioned Icewrack finally appearing physically in Season 2. There is no other frozen land of pure ice in the second season other than this place, so this frozen waste has to be Icewrack. Now let's talk about this eternal gazing. I think that the line, or a frozen waste eternal gazing, ascribes a human quality into something that is inanimate. The human quality is the gaze, since it is an action of the eyes. The inanimate object is the frozen waste. In the context of Dragon's Blood, I personally think that the line is referring to Lyrac herself, the one Eldworm where Oroth came from. This is because the elements of creation are actually sentient entities on top of being the building blocks of creation. They express their sentience in the form of the intelligent Eldworm spirits, making the dragon bodies that they fill their own souls with the very incarnation of what composes the universe. That being said, Lyrac is the element of water, which includes ice, which is why the water dragons have a frosty breath. As such, the frozen waste could very well be Lyrac herself, who is the very element of water, including ice. Notice the emphasis on calling its gaze eternal in this stanza, perhaps referring to the fact that the Eldworms are essentially immortal. For example, the Eldworm Slyrac brags that he has watched something as old as the mountains themselves drown in oceans, and he was aware of the 3,000 years when Kashura was separated from the thunder. After all, these Eldworms are literally forces of creation, so they must be as old as the universe itself. Let's move on to what the first stanza says about ancient agonies survive in Oroth's poem. The entire line itself is very intriguing. What are these ancient agonies, and why did they survive? Allow me to first define the word agony. Agony doesn't always mean pain. It also means a struggle, from struggles of dying people who are trying to cling to life, to any kind of violent struggles like war and conflicts. Now that is an agony. In Dragon's Blood, agony was mentioned at least twice, one explicit and one implicit. The explicit one is from Oroth herself, who once said it to a resurrected Mirana.
I tried to capture your agony in a poem. Would you like to hear it?
The implicit one is from Vajrak, who mentions the painful process of childbirth in his speech before killing the Eldworms.
Oh, flailing arms, birth screams, and mother's blood.
Both of these mentions of agony are struggles. The first one is an agony because Mirana was caught between worlds. She was both alive and dead. Mirana's spirit struggled to return to life until the sun itself shone on her, resurrecting the princess as it dispelled the layer of gold on her body. The second one doesn't need much explaining. Childbirth in itself is a very painful experience, a chaotic struggle to bring the baby into the world of the living. So of course, it is an agony. So what does this agony have to do with Orat's poem? With the examples that I mentioned earlier, I think it was referring to the birth of the individual Orat. Perhaps the agony is the struggle of the radiant ore to separate Orat from the thunder, so that she can become a sentient individual distinct from the whole she came from. Or perhaps the agony is on the other side, where Orat is the one struggling to return to her Eldworm Lyrak, while she was being pulled away by the radiant ore. Or it could be both at the same time, where there are struggles between the thunder and the ore to claim Orat to their sides, which is why the plural word agonies is used in her poem. Also, both entities are primordial in nature, which explains why they are called ancient in her poem. Speaking of ancient, I have yet another interpretation of the line, but it still involves what I said earlier about the struggle between the thunder and the radiant. What if the line, "Ancient agonies survive," means that the radiant ancient within the ore actually won control over Orat against the thunder, which is why it survived in the struggle? Nevertheless, I think that all of my interpretations are fine, but these are all just theories really. The second stanza is the consequences of what I said earlier. Thunder lost means that she has been cut off from the thunder. Very simple. Besides her story about her encounter with the radiant ore that she told in Book 2 in Chapter 3, Orat mentions this again when she first transforms into a humanoid body.
Hi. I mean, what?
When my last dream of the thunder ended, I awakened like this.
The next one is a lot less simple, but not too deep. Lone Voices Praising refers to Orat herself, who is now alone without her kin, now that she has been severed from the whole that is the thunder and their dream where the rest of the dragons are once they are asleep. Although Voices is plural, which might imply multiple beings, it could also apply to just one being, which is Orat. After all, you can talk multiple times, making your voice plural even if you don't have multiple voices apart from your own. The praising in this line is very interesting. The first thing I thought of when I read this is that this praising is the dragon song, or at least the song of Orat, since the poem seems to be about her being torn away from the thunder. As for why these lone voices are praising, maybe the lone voices that is Orat is praising the fact that she's finally an individual. After all, she has this to say.
In time, my Eldworm's voice faded. I collected books, began writing verse. The dragon songs never returned. But in my solitude, I had the most wonderful thought. I am.
Also, lone voices being plural may refer to the fact that Orat wrote poems as a substitute for the dragon songs. So her poems are actually her voice, her song. Slyrak says these about her poetry.
Your song is different than ours now, bereft of the true song. It's no wonder you feel compelled to create.
Lastly, One from Many Has Derived speaks about Orat herself separating from Lyrak and the thunder. All dragons are very much akin to a hive mind, where multiple bodies share a single mind. This single mind belongs to the soul of the Eldworm of a specific dragon type. For instance, all water dragons are just extensions of their Eldworm Lyrak's mind and will. So technically, all of the water dragons are just one big creature or one big dragon body controlled by a single mind. However, With the ancient will of the Radiant Ore, it managed to separate Orat while giving her own mind and voice, making her distinct from the hive mind and turning her into an individual creature. To summarize, this poem details the origins of Orat in poetry form. In Icewrack, there was a struggle for control over Orat between Lyrak and the Radiant Ancient inside the ore in Orat's lair. In time, the latter won as it separated Orat from the wholeness of Lyrak. Because Orat was separated from her Eldworm, she no longer dreamt of the thunder, and thus, she no longer heard their songs in her sleep, like all other dragons. Still, she praised her newfound individuality and found herself free to live her own life without the supreme consciousness willing her every move. Let's get to the next poem.
In repose, not dead but dreaming, breathless, still as winter's morn, the dawn star rises, silent, gleaming elegies of rage forborn.
Orat recited this poem for the somewhat dead Princess Mirana. She was somewhat dead because she learned from her magic that Mirana wasn't actually slain by the arrow. The first stanza pretty much tells us her findings on Mirana's strange condition.
Over thousands of years, I've seen wonders and horrors. Never this. The arrow was meant to kill her. It should have killed her.
So it missed some vital target.
No. The princess is somehow dead and alive, all at once. Like a dream of death. Like a poem.
Just tell me if there's anything you can do or not.
Hope yet remains. The aura of death is gone, as if you burned it from your own blood. You were trapped, princess, caught between worlds, living and dead. I tried to capture your agony in a poem. Would you like to hear it?
This is why Orat merely describes the princess' so-called death as a state of stasis or tranquility. Mirana isn't dead. She is simply still and silent, like sleeping. The second stanza emphasizes this, saying that she is as still as winter's morn. The word morn is basically another word for morning, which also means dawn or beginning. Winter is used as a metaphor for emotionlessness, because winter is the season of stillness in nature. Flowing water stops as it freezes into unmoving ice. Animals go into their dens to be still in their long sleep, and plants caught in winter's chill shrivel and die. Winter has long been used in poetry as a metaphor for death because of this. But the most interesting part of the poem are its final stanzas. Orat sings about the rising dawn star, which is basically the sun that she is looking to, as it gleams elegies of rage forborn. An elegy is a poem of mourning. It is usually related to death, since elegies are dedicated to the loss of a loved one. Forborn is the past tense for the word forbear, which means to refrain or hold yourself back from doing something. As we all know, Mirana turns out to be the incarnation of a powerful dragon god called the World Worm. It's so powerful, in fact, that it's the source of all the dragons and the Eldworms, as well as having the power that Slyrak believes will allow him to peer into the hidden Falfell, so that he can kill Terrorblade, on top of it being an omnipresent being across all 15 planes of existence and the infinite multiverse. The World Worm appears to us as the sun, which is why Mirana and her family, being the solar god and the solar goddess of the Helio Imperium, turn out to be related to it. That being said, the stanza refers to the World Worm mourning Mirana's death with elegies, but deep down, it is actually furious at her death, because the poem sings about its rage forborn. The poem sings about the World Worm having an anger that it is currently holding back, possibly directed towards whoever killed its descendant. The same stanza also uses the word gleaming in place of the word talking or singing, because shining light is the only way the sun can express itself. Gleaming is a form of self-expression for the sun, as talking is a form of self-expression for humans. In summary, Oroth must have communed with the world worm through the sun and heard its elegies for Marana. She also must have felt what the world worm was feeling for Marana, which led to Oroth reciting this poem.
Solitary congregants, reach for light we cannot see. Beyond the veil, the end of things, shadows dance. Death beckons me. She whispers soft across the void. Take my hand, be not afraid. I am the light, but in disguise. No death, no shadow. Love conveyed. It was enough.
This touching poem is the longest among the 3 poems that Oroth has written. Let's get to the first stanza. Given the context of this poem and the nature of its author Oroth, perhaps the first stanza refers to dragons who were separated from the thunder. Remember what I said about all dragons being a hive mind, or an entire creature composed of many bodies and one mind? Oroth used to be a part of Lyrak's body, or the hive mind of water dragons, but she was soon separated when she gained her own consciousness. This is what her poem meant by solitary congregants. All dragons are like a congregation, a gathering of multiple beings. But in the case of Oroth, she used to be a part of the congregation of Lyrak, alongside her other water dragons, and now she is alone, now that she is separated. Ashura is another example of a solitary congregant, since he was also a part of the being of Bisrak, the sum and congregation of all void dragons, until he was cut off by the Nemesis Stones. The second stanza, Reach for light we cannot see, might refer to the world worm itself. As he explained his true nature, Ashura reveals to Marana that all dragons are parts of the world worm. The world worm is embodied by the sun, which in turn is embodied by the solar god and solar goddess, and all of their descendants, like Marana. It's pretty much the light opposite the darkness, and the reason why the lonely Kashura found the Helio Imperium. Since he was separated from the thunder, who in turn is connected to the world worm, Kashura seeks to return himself to the light that he was once a part of. The best way he could get back to it again is through the Helio Imperium, where the solar deities make their home there. Being the closest thing to the world worm itself, he can now begin his plan to merge back into the light that he was cut off from for so long. Also, perhaps the poem calls it unseeable, because not even the Eldworms are aware of the world worm, even if they are a part of it. Even Slyrak didn't know the true nature of the eye at first, and neither did Kashura, since he had to learn about the truth by traveling to many different realities. But given the next lines of the poem, perhaps the light is unseeable because the one who wrote the poem is in a place of darkness. The third stanza, Beyond the Veil, the End of Things, refers to the afterlife and death itself. In Dota 2 lore, there is a veil that all things that have died must cross to enter the afterlife. The concept of the veil comes from the real-life phrase, beyond the veil, which is said when someone has passed away. The veil is one of the few lore elements carried over the dragon's blood. Visage mentions the deadly veil several times, also referencing the afterlife beyond it.
That which passes beyond the veil must forever stay. Once a mortal passes beyond the veil, they may never return. It is one thing to animate a corpse from beneath the ground. It is another to rip a soul from beyond the veil.
This ties in with the next stanza, Shadow Stands, Death Beckons Me. This stanza describes what the writer saw beyond the veil. Here, they mention that death itself, disguised in darkness, called for them to embrace finality. A stance is basically any position that a person can assume. It can be physical, like a martial arts stance, or something more abstract like a political stance. So if you assume a stance, it would make you look different. For instance, a human can assume a crane stance to make them look like a crane. In this case, death itself took a shadow stance, making it appear as dark as the color black. And now for the last 4 stanzas. She whispers soft across the void. Take my hand, be not afraid. I am the light put in disguise. No death, no shadow, love conveyed. This stanza reveals that the shadowy death that the writer saw was just the disguise of someone or something else. This someone or something beckoned them, revealing herself to be the light. The light herself appeared to the author in the void, saying that it was neither death nor darkness. All that it gave her was her love. Personally, I think that this stanza describes a scene where the author saw the worldworm itself when they died. How do I know this? Let's recap what I said earlier about the worldworm. This dragon god is incarnated by the sovereigns of the Helio Imperium. But not just any king or queen that takes the solar throne can be an incarnation of the worldworm. Only those who belong to Mirana's own bloodline, like her parents and grandparents, are the true incarnations of the worldworm. This is why Shabara was not a real solar god with arcane power. He may have been Mirana's uncle, but I am fairly certain he belonged to a different family or bloodline. That being said, one of the worldworm's incarnation is the mother of Mirana, God Empress Shurzi. This is proven in the scenes where Mirana hears her mother's voice with the worldworm around. The first one is when Mirana was about to be corrupted by the Dire Stone in Book 1, Chapter 3.
Mirana, you have forgotten me.
The voice in this scene has a distinct British accent, similar to Mirana and her voice actress, Lara Pulver. Book 2, Chapter 6 confirms this when Mirana explains to Kashura what she heard while she was somewhat dead.
I remember a feeling, a certain warm serenity I could have remained inside of forever. But there was also a voice. It was gentle, but persistent. It was my mother's voice, waking me as though I were a child.
And what did your mother say?
A word. Remember.
Remember your place. Remember your duty. Remember, you are loved.
Yes.
Her admonitions for you as a girl.
We hear her mother's voice saying the same word remember once again when Mirana finally confirms the power within her using the eye in the throne room.
remember. I feel it. I remember.
This pretty much dispels any doubt that Scherzy is indeed the World Worm made flesh, just like her daughter. So what does this have to do with the poem? Well, the poem refers to the light as a her, so this has to be the World Worm in the form of Scherzy beckoning the author. And now for the interpretation. What does this poem in its entirety mean? First of all, this was written by Orot and no one else. Her beloved Bram is reading it in her memory. The cover on her book is the same one as the one he took from Orot's library, and no one but Orot is the poet character of Dragon's Blood. There can be no room for doubt that this is Orot's poetry. So this means that the speaker in this poem is indeed Orot, which means that everything in the poem is something that she experienced happened to her in first person. My interpretation is that this is the fate of Orot during her afterlife. When she died, her spirit fell into the underworld to embrace her afterlife. However, she was saved by the World Worm herself, who disguised herself as darkness in the void of finality. Assuming a stance of shade, she beckoned Orot to return to her, conveying her love for her prodigal daughter. Lost from the source for so long, Orot finally returned from whence she came. But if this is the case, then this interpretation raises some questions. How did Orot write a poem about her end? Perhaps she foresaw her fate and wrote about it. But if she did see her future, then how did she do it? I don't recall any instance of Orot having the ability to see the future. What's even more absurd is the idea that she did not foresee it, but rather, she wrote about it after she died. It's absurd because she can't write poems if she's dead, but perhaps she has magic for that. Perhaps this is why Orot's last words to Bram was, "I had the most wonderful thought." But who knows?
Claim your father's power. Claim his throne.
What about you?
I'll write a poem. It will be beautiful. It will be for you.
That's all for this analysis of Orot's poetry. I'll see you all on the next video.